Hello and welcome to a Monday night post Christmas showdown breakdown. Justin Herbert at Nick Foles. Yes, you may not remember BDN Nick Foles because he has barely played football at all in the last roughly 1.5 years. However, after Matt Ryan blew the biggest lead in the history of the NFL, Colts decided to make the move and go to Nick Foles, their third starting quarterback this year, following Matt Ryan. Following Sam Ellinger, as always, joined by our showdown virgin himself, Cody Main. Cody, how's it going?
I'm good. It was Big Cock Brock a few weeks ago. It's a Big Dick Nick tonight. I'm pretty excited for this slate. I always love these Charger slates because there's so many different ways to go. So really excited for this one.
Yeah, I think Nick Foles is part of the story. For me, from a macro perspective on this slate, the story is the way you beat the Chargers, to me, is very clearly by running the football. And so they don't have Jonathan Taylor here, but everybody's game plan against the Chargers seems to be similar. Hey, we're going to try to run it right down their throat. That's what everybody tries to do. In theory, that sets up well for Zach Moss. In theory, that sets up well for Deion Jackson. However, can you execute that game plan and can you keep it close enough to execute that game plan? Chargers offense obviously can be explosive, has a lot of good players, hasn't shown that. And the other side of the macro stuff to me is, God, Justin Herbert, man. I mean, he's had better spots than this and failed, not failed, but not been overly impressive. Does he get right and find a ceiling game here? Cody, how do you think about this game from a macro perspective?
Yeah, I want to start with the Justin Herbert stuff real quick before we jump into the position by position stuff, because just looking through his box scores even, and you can see it there on the distribution chart. I mean, the right tail of his distribution, there are some massive, massive games well within his range of outcomes. We just haven't seen it this season. And we've seen he's gone 275 and 2. He's gone 300 with no touchdowns. We just haven't seen that 300-yard, get the DraftKings bonus, throw for 3 touchdowns, and give me 30 plus DraftKings points. We just haven't seen it at all this season. And you mentioned it, it feels like he's just due for one of those games because he's been so close in so many different spots. Finally has all of his weapons healthy. I think this is the third consecutive week that we'll see Keenan Allen and Mike Williams and all these guys. I feel like this is finally the time for Justin Herbert to get right. On the other side, it sets up really well for Zach Moss if we can assume that the usage from last week trends in the same direction. And this is the way that, like you mentioned, this is a way to beat the Chargers team. But we have like a half or a little over one half of a sample of how this team wants to handle their Zach Moss and Deion Jackson split. Now we have another guy in the mix as well. So it will be interesting to see how these two offenses interact with one another. The other component to this slate that's really interesting is we haven't seen these egregious pricing mishaps from DraftKings recently. Maybe they were away on Christmas, who knows? But there are some interesting pricing. I'll call them mistakes on the Colts side that really set up interesting from a roster construction perspective. You have Justin Herbert and Keenan and Big Mike and Eckler, and you might expect even more utilization for the Chargers heavy lineups, but some of these really cheap Colts options, who we'll get to when we talk about the skill position players, really keep the 3-3s, even some of the 2-4 stuff more in play tonight. And you can find really nicely projected lineups that feature Colts heavy stuff, even with Nick Foles under center.
Yeah, I think that's interesting. And I do have some micro takes on some of the stuff you mentioned there as we get into it from a roster construction standpoint. Here we are showing a decent amount of 5-1 Chargers. I saw you tweeted the how these constructions have been doing, how the field has been faring versus top 1%, which I think is always interesting to look at. It seems like this year 5-1s and 4-2s on the favorite side has been winning more than it's been being played. I don't even think about that here. It looks like it's gonna be pretty heavy here.
Yeah, and I think these are the spots where maybe we can get a little bit different by playing away from public perception. Obviously, you have Justin Herbert versus Nick Foles. You have the pass catching options on the Chargers side, who are all much more attractive than their Colts counterparts. And I think this stuff is usually pretty efficient in terms of how often it's owned versus how often it wins type of thing, or how often it finds itself in the top 1%. Certainly tonight, I do think we'll get paid off with a pretty big ownership discount if we want to flip the build and maybe go a little bit more Colts heavy. It is only a 4-point spread. Maybe they keep this game close and it's kind of more of a slog, which I think would play into the Colts' hand a little bit. I'm telling you, I kind of like some of these Colts heavy builds because they project well. We can get some interesting options back on the Chargers side. And I think the 2-4 way, if I was trying to flip the build a little bit, the 2-4, 2 Chargers, 4 Colts would be one way that I would trying to find a way to get unique in tournaments tonight.
Okay. Mentioned the Justin Herbert stuff. My take on the Justin Herbert stuff is, I mean, last week was just like the absolute perfect setup for Justin Herbert. Everybody was finally healthy for Justin Herbert, and he did not extend his average depth of target, his A dot still, which was really, really frustrating to me. Like I thought against the Titans, he would be pushing the ball down the field. He had Mike Williams healthy, he had Eckler healthy, he had Keenan, he had Josh Palmer, he had Gerald Everett. I mean, that is a really, really good pass catching core facing a Titans defense, which is basically playing a JV unit, and he still was unable. I mean, he ended up with over 300 yards, but it was ugly. It was like a struggle to get 300 yards, and that's concerning to me. Now, the good news here, Indianapolis has one of the worst pass rushes in the league, in theory at least. If he wants to have some time to throw the ball down the field tonight, I think he will have it. But man, we just haven't seen it all year. And so at 10-4, I certainly think Justin Herbert is a very, very, very good play. If you think a lot of these short little targets condense on one guy, you could see one of the receivers pop up to be the optimal captain here. So what do you think about Herbert at 80% total ownership, 16% projected captain ownership?
Yeah, I do tend to think that his total ownership is pretty efficient tonight. I think he might end up going under owned at captain for some of the same reasons that you just mentioned. You know, targets have been condensing. We've seen big Mike games. We've seen big Eckler games. We've seen big Keenan games. The targets just haven't been evenly distributed enough, and we haven't seen Herbert do enough in the yardage column and the touchdown column to warrant him being played at captain. So I think 16% is probably a little bit too low. Maybe it comes up in some of the smaller field contests, but I think it should be closer to 20, maybe 25%, given the fact that he does have a full complement of weapons. I think it's relatively easy to see a scenario where targets are more evenly distributed and you get a game from Herbert where he does beat all of his pass catchers. I think at 10-4, he's a lock for cash games, probably makes for the best cash game captain on tonight's slate. I'm trying to find ways to play some different combinations of Captain Herbert double stacks because I think we have that potential range here where we can see targets be evenly distributed and we can see him beat all of his pass catchers in the DraftKings column.
Yeah, Herbert captain as a double stack, I think is very, very interesting. I think a lot of the people who do play Herbert at captain will have doubles there, so you got to be careful there. But yeah, I think it's at least worth thinking through. The Nick Foles thing is interesting, man. I don't think Nick Foles is like that much worse than this version of Matt Ryan. However, not playing football, not playing NFL competitive football in a year and a half, I think that matters. Like you just haven't been out there. And I know Rufus has talked about this in golf. Like, I mean, the best he has docs on guys who haven't played competitive golf. Like you have to be out there playing. Nick Foles has not done that. And so I have some concerns that Nick Foles falls flat on his face here. However, I hate saying that on Showdown because we've seen so many dust ball quarterbacks get into optimal lineups because they play the quarterback position and you're not competing against all the other quarterbacks. You're competing against other players on the slate, unlike you would on a main slate. So I don't want to say Nick Foles is a fade for me. It's just hard for me to find a big ceiling on him here. We have the field kind of thinking similarly, 39% total ownership, 5% captain. What do you think there?
Yeah, I'm wrestling with this one too. In cash game roster construction, in tournaments, I'm trying to wrestle the projection versus what I think perception might be. And he actually projects really well given some of the other options on his own team. And at 9K, he's going to pop into plenty of optimal lineups or optimal type lineups for anybody that's building using any sort of projection system. But then you have this combating narrative with public perception. He hasn't played in a year and a half. I mean, it's Nick Foles behind this offensive line in this version of the Colts offense with what we expect to be a run-heavy game plan. And I could see scenarios where he comes in well below that 39.5% projected ownership. And as just a product of the position that he plays, he's far more likely to be optimal than he would be owned in that situation. But I just don't know in the contest that I'll be playing, like how much of that competing narrative of him, the layoff plus just the perception of Nick Foles is going to reduce his ownership. I think at 39.5%, it's relatively efficient. I think he makes for an okay cash game option because he's a quarterback. I'm going to try and find ways to probably avoid it if I think it comes in at 40 in tournaments and just hope that maybe his targets condense to one of the pass catchers on his team.
Yeah, see, I actually think that Keenan and Big Mike are both better plays than Nick Foles in a vacuum, and they're right around him in price. In other words, 9,800 Keenan Allen, 9,400 Mike Williams, 9,000 Nick Foles, and I even throw 8,200 Michael Pittman into the mix there. To me, like I think those guys are better plays in full PPR with 100-yard bonus stuff than Nick Foles is, even though he plays quarterback. And like I hate saying bad things about quarterback on Showdown because I don't think it's right. But just like my first instinct is I'd rather have Keenan, Big Mike, and Pittman. I think the field will too. And so in hand building stuff, I see what you're saying, that Nick Foles might come in even lower than we have it here, 40%. And anytime you get a quarterback lower than 40%, I mean, no one's given a lot of these guys a chance, these dust ball quarterbacks. Baker Mayfield comes to mind, Dalton on a Showdown slate, Purdy, like, and I don't think Nick Foles is even as good as those guys, but I just want to put that out there about the quarterback. Let's go to running back. Let's start with Austin Eckler because I do think everybody getting healthy for the Chargers makes a difference for Austin Eckler. In other words, when Keenan was out, when Josh Palmer was out, when Big Mike was out at times, I mean, they only had one or two of these guys for most of the season. Eckler's target share on a weekly basis was just insane. I think his floor is lower now than it was at those times. I'd also add that Josh Kelly is playing a decent amount, not a ton and not high value touches, but a decent amount. And so I think that you can find an Eckler fade here earlier, easier than you could earlier in the year when everybody was out, if that makes sense. We still have 68% total ownership and 18% captain on Austin Eckler at 11K. I don't want to say bad things about Austin Eckler either, man. But again, I do think this is worse for him than it's been in the past. What do you think about him? And then Josh Kelly could be a so bad it's good pay up. But God, that makes me puke also.
Yeah, I feel terrible saying anything bad about Austin Eckler. Clearly built for this type of PPR friendly format, can get it from both ways in terms of doing it on the ground with the high leverage touches and doing it through the air as Justin Herbert's preferred safety valve. But I think he's getting hit from both directions now, with Joshua Kelly playing more and handling a little bit more of the team's rushing attempts of late. And now you have Keenan back, you have Big Mike back, Gerald Everett, Joshua Palmer is a very capable wide receiver 3. It's tough to see. Not only, of course, his floor is lower because you could just see those touches fall out, but I think his chances of hitting a ceiling are also lower now as well. So I think because the field has the money to pay up for an $11,000 Austin Eckler relatively easily, the base projection is still very strong for us and across the industry. I think you could see this ownership creep up to 75, 80% in some contests. Captain could push 25%. I think at those levels, as tough as it is to stomach, I think it makes for a reasonable fade, just given the fact that he could have a really good game and still fail to pay off that price tag if he doesn't fall into the end zone, and if he just doesn't rack up as nearly as many catches as he had in previous weeks with some of those guys, with Keenan, with Big Mike out. So I hate to piggyback off of that and kind of recommend an Eckler fade, but I think there are certainly paths where he could fall short of winning lineups tonight.
Okay. I want to talk about the Colts thing. So here's my take on the Colts thing. Jonathan Taylor went down on like the second snap of that game against the Vikings that everybody saw, the biggest comeback in NFL history. Now, they went on to take a massive halftime lead and be winning for almost the entire game. In those types of game scripts, that's more Zach Moss. The better pass catching back to me is very clearly Deion Jackson. And when they had to throw the ball, when the game got close, it was more Deion Jackson in the mix. I believe Deion Jackson also had a fumble in that game, which may have hurt his playing time. I personally think Deion Jackson is the better player. Deion Jackson had a couple really big games earlier in the year when Jonathan Taylor was out catching a ton of balls. I think it's really sneaky here to play Deion Jackson over Zach Moss. Hope that the Chargers get behind and you see a ton of Deion Jackson. Again, I think he will be out there in passing situations. Zach Moss will not. The flip side of that coin is the way you beat the Chargers is by running it down their throat, and Zach Moss is better for that. So in scripts, in narratives where the Colts are winning, Colts win the game, Colts have a bunch of goal line opportunities, you could see more Zach Moss. But again, I think that at half the ownership, less than half, I prefer Deion Jackson here. I know that sounds like a bit of a hot take. What do you think about Colts running back?
Yeah, we had a similar spot to this one recently on Thursday night with Zonovan Knight and Michael Carter in the Jets backfield, and the projection gap was similar. The price difference was different. We had Zonovan Knight at 7K, and Michael Carter was a little bit cheaper than Zonovan Knight, but the ownership gap was relatively similar as well. And Michael Carter ended up being the guy that you needed in the optimal lineup because the game script played out in his favor, where you got some of those Michael Carter dump offs late. And I could see Zach Moss being a part of an early winning lineup because of the way the game script is built from the first half and earlier on. But I think Deion Jackson, as this game maybe gets away from the Colts, is the guy that is utilized more in pass down situations. And we should be honest with ourselves that our sample size of Zach Moss being the de facto lead back in this offense is relatively small. It could certainly flip back Deion Jackson's favor for early down work as well. So I like that. Basically you're getting paid off with a 2-to-1 ownership discount on Deion Jackson. He's $600 more expensive. So I find it hard for not only the Opto bros, but the hand builders to get on to Deion Jackson. And it does play into the game script if you think the Chargers, come in, take care of business against the Colts, cover the 4-point spread, and we get some Deion Jackson dump offs late. He could certainly pay off that price tag.
I mean, not only do we only have 3/4 or so of data on this split, but it was like the weirdest game script ever. You know what I mean? Like literally one of the weirdest game scripts. They were up 33-0 at halftime. So I'm not putting maybe as much stock as the market is in that last week. Let's go to wide receiver on the Colts. Oh God. So I was a massive favorite to make the finals of the 333 best ball on DraftKings. Massive favorite. And this guy comes all the way back on me with 37 from Cam Akers and 25 from James Conner last night to make it a game. Now he only needs 9.8 out of Paris Campbell. We have him for 8.6. I mean, it's just
God.
unbelievable how it always comes down to this. We also have an under on Paris Campbell and props we took earlier this week, under 44.5. That line's been battered down a lot. I think it's down to 38.5 or so right now. Michael Pittman, regardless of who's been quarterback, has been the alpha though for this team. We saw a bunch of big Paris Campbell games in the middle of the season when they were throwing really short. He seemed to have a good connection going with Matt Ryan. I'd feel better about a Paris Campbell fade with Nick Foles under center. I think the guy everybody wants to play though is Michael Pittman because he plays literally every snap, is very good at earning targets. It's just his ADOT has been so low this year. He hasn't had huge games, but I think he's played fine. The other guy people like to click is Alec Pierce, who plays a ton. In theory, has big deep playability, has not flashed it very often. He had that incredible spot against the Vikings last week and failed on that Saturday slate. So tell me, Cody, that you don't like Paris Campbell tonight. And what do you think about Michael Pittman, Pierce? And I even think Doolin is actually in the mix, who came in and I thought played pretty well last night.
Well,
Last week, sorry.
I'll say this much on Paris Campbell. He might be the so bad that it's good play from this group because you look at Michael Pittman, $8,200 price tag for him. He's $800 cheaper than his quarterback, Nick Foles. And this is a guy that the fantasy community as a whole has liked since he's come into the league. So I think that we'll see a little bit more favor paid towards Michael Pittman, where he's $800 cheaper and the base projection is relatively similar. I think maybe he gets up to 55-60% total ownership if some of that comes away from Nick Foles. And then down at Alec Pierce, the rookie, this is a guy that I had been flag planting on previous Colts Showdown slates at 5,400, 5,200. And now he's 2,800. He's running a route on, 85% of the team's dropbacks. He isn't earning targets at an insanely high level, but the targets that he is earning are further downfield. And I think that's where, Nick Foles might excel a little bit more than Matt Ryan in pushing the ball deep downfield. I think that we're going to end up seeing this ownership gap get really wide between Pierce and Pittman, and then Campbell being the guy that gets lost in the sauce in the middle at 5,400. He doesn't project any better than than Alec Pierce does. Michael Pittman separates in a big way from a base projection standpoint. I think Paris Campbell might be between 10 and 15% owned, just with the way the slate sets up. And I think in large field tournaments, certainly a guy that is going to need to rack up short ADOT type volume. And you're probably just hoping for like an 8 for 73 type of box score from him. But man, I just see ownership getting squeezed here because Pittman and Pierce are so obvious.
Okay. I don't feel great. I do think Paris Campbell can like rack up some catches here. Yeah, just on Doolin for a second here. He's only 2,600. We don't have a great projection on him. I do think he's actually like a pretty good player who showed up last week. It's impossible to have a good projection on him because he doesn't play that much, but I do think he's a guy that can actually like show up, and maybe he's been working on the backup team with Nick Foles. Who knows? There's a little bit of narrative there, but I do think he's at least in play for tournaments at just 4%. Just want to put that out there. On the other side, the Los Angeles Chargers. So, given the way Justin Herbert's played this year, i.e., get the ball out quick, get it out short, it just fits Keenan Allen's game really well, obviously. And like Keenan Allen is very, very good at getting open in short area, one of the best in the NFL at getting open in the short area. That's like the cash game play. The Mike Williams play is the alpha play, which I think everybody wants to play. I know you had a flag plant on Mike Williams when he went off on a showdown slate 1 or 2 weeks ago. And then Josh Palmer, I still think is a decent football player who is the number 3 wide receiver. So what do you think about what's going on with Chargers wide receivers?
Yeah, I definitely agree with the Keenan Allen take. Certainly the cash game type player on Showdown, and he does get a slight boost. I hate to overreact too much to the wide receiver cornerback stuff, but Kenny Moore has been a really good slot corner this season for the Colts. Has helped them limit opposing slot receiver production. He's going to be out, I think, for the 3rd consecutive week, and when he's been out, the team has been a little bit more willing and forgiving to opposing slot receivers. Not that Keenan can't win against anybody, but I certainly think that that's a slight boost to Keenan. I would prefer him in cash game style contests where he's just $400 more expensive than Big Mike, and the range of outcomes are just a little bit more narrow for him given his short ADOT. I was hoping that when I ran ownership projections, I would be paid off with another Big Mike ownership discount, but I don't think we're going to get that. I think that the field has the money to pay up for multiple of these guys if they so choose. We could see Keenan and Big Mike in lineups together, but I don't think because salary isn't a huge constraint, I don't think the field's going to find it as difficult to pay up for Mike Williams. So I think 40-45%, maybe up to 50 even, is possible on Big Mike. And again, not to overreact to the wide receiver cornerback stuff, but he does have a matchup, likely shadow matchup against Stephon Gilmore. The Colts defense has been really good about limiting explosive pass plays. And certainly with the way that the Chargers offense is playing with the short ADOT stuff, doesn't exactly set up for a Big Mike eruption spot. I would want to get paid off with a little bit lower ownership if I'm going that direction. And lastly, on Palmer, he might make for the so bad it's good pay up to be contrarian type play. I don't think his price tag is fully adjusted yet for Keenan and Big Mike being back. When we get to tight end here, I would straight up prefer Everett over Josh Palmer, where he's $1,800 cheaper. If Joshua Palmer was $5,400 or $4,800 or in that range, I might have a little bit more interest, but I think he's still just a little bit too expensive.
Yeah, I like the Mike Williams fade. I'm curious what you think in Herbert captain teams. What do you think the most common double is going to be? I was going to say Keenan, Big Mike, but now that the more I think about it, it might be Keenan Eckler or Keenan Everett actually might be the most popular one. Actually, I'm going to say that I think Herbert captain, Keenan, Everett in flex will be the most popular Herbert double. Would you agree there?
Yeah, I agree for sure. And then you're probably going to see a lot of 4-2 type roster constructions with Captain Herbert, and you're also going to see Eckler in there as not necessarily a third strict pass catcher, but as like the fourth option. So I think getting away from it, if you want to go Palmer as a way to get different, if you want to go Big Mike as a way to get different, makes sense in those roster constructions as well.
If you want to go down to one of these wide receivers, Doolin may not play very much. Carter, I think, may not play very much either. I would consider them kind of similar. Do you have a preference between DeAndre Carter or Doolin as kind of a punt down here?
I think I prefer Doolin straight up, because if you want to play Doolin, he almost makes for just like a one-for-one direct pivot off of who I expect to be one of the most popular pay down options on the slate in Alec Pierce. And if you just build a lineup that you like that's got $2,800 left and you want to get unique immediately, just drop from Pierce to Doolin in the same roster construction.
Okay. You mentioned the price tag on Gerald Everett. They left him at $4,800. Now, Gerald Everett started off the season very, very good. I thought he was going to have a really good year, especially after the Chargers lost a bunch of their guys to injury. He consistently underperformed despite wearing number 7 and a dark visor. Somehow he still underperformed. Now everybody's healthy here, and it's kind of harder for Gerald Everett to find targets, I think, but he's very, very cheap here. What do you think about him? And then we do have to mention, of course, our hero from the XFL, hero from previous flag plants, Big Dick Don Parham himself. What do you think on these two guys?
Yeah, all of the alpha target earners are back. Big Dick Donald Parham is back as well. And it's tough to see a big, huge ceiling on Gerald Everett, but you don't necessarily need one at 4,800. And generally speaking, DraftKings has been reluctant to really price down these tight ends. And I wouldn't consider this aggressively pricing down Gerald Everett, but usually we see them closer to 6K in that kind of price range. And I think the $800 to $1,000 discount on Gerald Everett makes him a relatively strong play. It'll probably result in him being, like you mentioned, one of the more popular options to pair with Herbert in double stacks. And maybe for that reason, you can talk yourself into a fade. He still kind of profiles as a touchdown or bust type of guy. He's not going to get peppered with targets in this spot. So I don't think you're going to get a big box score result unless he finds his way into the end zone.
Yeah. And the thing about Everett is when you get into that 4,800 range, you start getting into the range of the kickers and the defenses, right? So like Chargers defense is 4,600, Dicker is 4,200, McLaughlin is 4K, Colts defense is 3,400. You know, I think the floor on kicker and defense might be higher than Everett. Obviously, Everett has a way, way, way higher ceiling. Would you agree there? And we do need to get to the Colts tight ends, but I just want to get your take on Everett versus some of these other guys in this range.
Yeah, I think from a floor perspective, particularly looking at cash game roster construction, you'll probably find yourself in this 4 to 5K range for one spot at least. I would certainly prefer the kicker, and for me, it would be Dicker over these guys. Like raw ceiling for Everett is certainly higher than these guys. But if you're just looking for like a 70th percentile outcome, I think that the kickers and DSTs can compete. It just kind of comes down to an ownership play at that point. And I think Everett's ownership could be the one of that group in that range to get steamed up a little bit.
Okay, let's go back to Colts tight end. I have a narrative for you, Cody. Big Dick Nick is, of course, one of the presidents of the PSM, as is Mo Ali Cox and Jelani Woods. And Kylan Granson is out for this game. And the last time we saw Kylan Granson miss a game, Jelani Woods actually went nuke. I don't remember if that was a showdown slate or not. It may have been.
It was.
It was, yeah. And Jelani Woods went absolutely nuke. We also have the narrative of tight ends on showdown slates here. I mean, this is really, really lining up for one of these guys, Jelani Woods or Mo Ali Cox. And it seems like they prefer Jelani in the pass game. You see our projection there. We have 6.4 for Jelani and 3.9 for Mo Ali. There is a lot cooking here. Tell me I'm not crazy. The PSM has been back tested for many, many years. What do you think about Jelani and Mo Ali?
Yeah, this is a very PSM-driven slate with Big Dick Nick at quarterback, and then you have Donald Parham on the other side, and two PSM poppers in Jelani Woods and Mo Ali Cox. This was the other guy that I was referring to in DraftKings, kind of mispricing guys, with Mo Ali Cox left at the stone minimum, partially due to Kylan Granson being ruled out, after the fact, after pricing had already come out. But I think Mo Ali Cox being the stone minimum is going to make a lot of these roster constructions work. And I think in more opto bro driven contests, you could see that 11.2% steam up to 15-20%. And Jelani Woods, I think, will at least be partially insulated in terms of his ownership getting out of hand because of Alec Pierce at the exact same price tag. I kind of like that. If you remember, we have Alec Pierce at 25, 26, 27%. That may come closer to 30%. I don't think Jelani Woods is a 2-to-1 dog to be outscored by Alec Pierce. So I like Jelani Woods as also kind of a 1v1 pivot off of Pierce, who is certainly capable of airballing.
Yeah, and the other thing that insulates Jelani Woods' ownership is that like people aren't going to play both these guys. I don't think Woods and Mo Ali, and like people kind of like casual people just think they're the same guy. It's like, oh, they're big athletic tight ends for the Colts. I'll take the guy who's only 200. So yeah, it's really hard to see Jelani Woods getting steamed at all here. We already mentioned kicker and defense a little bit. Any further thoughts on kicker and defense here on this slate? We of course have this game in a dome.
I think the dome is nice for the kickers from a cash game perspective. I would imagine that given the value in the skill position room, we don't need to do the double kicker type lineups that we've been so accustomed to on showdown slates in cash game contests. Definitely trying to steer clear of that in tournaments as well, given the limited ceiling. The one thing that seemed interesting to me was how low owned the Chargers defense projected to be against Nick Foles, against this Civ-like offensive line from Indianapolis. I think particularly in 5-1 roster constructions, five Chargers, 1 Colt, we should be boosting that Chargers DST. I think if we see those outcomes where they easily cover the 4-point spread and they just dominate this Nick Foles led Colts team, the Chargers D could really put up a big score and beat a lot of those players priced in that similar range.
Yeah, I think that's interesting for sure. One other thing, and you guys can start getting some questions in if you have any. We have about 3 or 4 minutes here to get questions in. We'll answer as many as we can. One thing I want to note on Indy while I was thinking about it on the running back stuff, actually, you can play Moss and Deion Jackson together. In other words, like these guys are going to rotate a lot. There could be different game scripts within the game, goal line stuff to Zach Moss, bunch of catches to Deion Jackson. Like I can see, I wouldn't play either one in captain if you did that, but I think that both these guys in flex together can be okay. Similar to, I don't know what won last night. Did a Rashad White Lenny team together win again last night? Do you know? But it, like they both played well, and like we've seen Aaron Jones, AJ Dillon slates like that where they can both be in the optimal. So not to compare Zach Moss and Deion Jackson to either of those duos, but I think it's at least possible. JMO says, why don't kickers get partial points or 6 points for 60+ yard field goals? Good question. That is a question for the fine folks at DraftKings and FanDuel.com. I thought
we've seen it a couple times where 2 separate lineups have duped because, I don't know, like a DST has 9 points and then a kicker kicks a field goal and he has 9 points. And that lineup ends up being, chopping more ways than it should because we don't have partial points for kickers. I think it's an interesting ad that would eliminate some of that.
Okay. Doesn't look like we have any questions here, so we shall move to the flag plan portion of the program. I have a bunch of ways I could go, so Cody, I'll let you go first.
Yeah, I mean, you've got your pick of the litter from the PSM model. I'll let you pull that up. I wanted to go back to Alec Pierce, but after seeing that ownership, just can't not do it. I think Alec Pierce being kind of the obvious cash game play at 2,800, being the rookie that the fantasy community as a whole is somewhat infatuated with, I think will keep Jelani Woods' ownership in check. I hope it stays around that 13.4%. I think Jelani Woods can absolutely be an alpha as the Colts de facto tight end 1 with Kylan Granson sideline. 2,800 direct 1v1 pivot off of the chalky cash game wide receiver. Give me Jelani Woods in the flex in a winning lineup.
Yes, I like that a lot. Victor Garcia says Deion Jackson or Chargers defense better play. Do you have a take there, Cody?
I mean, there's a huge price difference on this slate. If you're not referring to a season-long type contest for some reason on this type of slate, I would prefer Deion Jackson. Yeah. But man, that's a big price difference.
Yeah, and we have obviously we have them somewhat similar in projection here, and there is a $3,000 difference in price. All right, I'm actually going to stick there. I think the Zach Moss stuff is a bit overblown and was related to them having such a big lead against the Vikings. I think Deion Jackson is the better player. He has been there for longer. He has had big games previously for the Colts when Jonathan Taylor was out. Now, I know they didn't have Zach Moss at the time, but still. And in scripts where I'm playing Herbert doubles or I'm playing 5-1s or I'm playing 4-2s in favor of the Chargers, I'm hoping for a lot of chances for short pass attempts. And I think that favors Deion Jackson here. So to get a running back who I think is overpriced at 7,600, but to get him at this relatively tame ownership, who I think could end up playing the most snaps on his team and is a pretty good player, I'll go with Deion Jackson in the optimal lineup tonight. One last question here from Matt. He says Foles and Pierce or McLaughlin and Moss. It's going to be kind of hard, I think, to not have Pierce in cash. And I normally lean quarterback in these cash game decisions also, Cody. So my lean would be Foles and Pierce, but do you have a take there?
Yeah, I do agree. And there's certainly some uncertainty with Foles coming back off of a 1.5-year layoff, but I think there's equal fragility in Moss's projection. So I would side with the Foles Pierce side.
Okay. All right. Good luck to everyone tonight. Really interesting game. I think I'm actually just like massively stressed about this Paris Campbell thing somehow. So I will be sitting there anti-sweating Paris Campbell, much like I sat there anti-sweating Cam Akers and James Conner last night, which did not go as well and took multiple years off my life. But good luck to everyone tonight. Maybe I'll just play 150 Paris Campbell captain teams. What could go wrong? All right. 4, Cody. 4, producer Adam. I'm Adam. Good luck, everybody.